Sally Hinds. It's a pleasure having you on David Anderson Talking Market Data. Now, you are unique amongst my guests for many reasons, but one particular reason, I was going to say you're so much older than me, but that would be a very rude thing to say. When you're not, but you are more experienced than I am, because I like to boast about my 41 years in the market data industry, which was started in September 1984 in TELERATE. But when I arrived at TELERATE, you were already there. You were already in situ. So you are one of the very few people in the industry who could actually claim to have done more time in market data than David Anderson. So hey, and there's not many of us with this leg. So look, as I was chatting beforehand, your LinkedIn profile will be in the descriptions. So will your DMCS, your consulting company. I probably didn't say that right, but it'll be properly annotated. Give us 2 minutes, vendors, user firms, consultancies. I mean, very briefly, you've had a very diverse career.
I really have, and it's beholden to me to say actually that before I even came into the city, I was in the oil and gas industry for 5 years. So, I mean, I literally did obviously start working from my pram, obviously.
Obviously, because you're really very young,
Very, very precocious child. Yeah. Anyway, so I did. TELERATE was also my first foray into financial services. And I actually came in as the marketing assistant at TELERATE. But as you were there, David, you know as well as I know that marketing meant nothing really at TELERATE. And it was all about me organising the sales conference in Cannes, actually, where our ambition was to drink as much champagne as you
and throw bread rolls at each other. That I remember.
And
we were so young.
We had a blast. I mean, you could almost have a podcast about, TELERATE, but we won't go there.
No.
So I was at TELERATE for about a year and a half, maybe. And then I went to the London Stock Exchange because it was Big Bang and that was very exciting. And I looked after customers S to Z, and I actually went out to see them, which was apparently not really supposed to happen. But you know me, I do what I wish to do.
I do know about you.
And then I was at Data for some years, another very interesting firm that's no longer with us, but very innovative for its day, particularly with its accounting practices. But again, we won't go there. So after Pont Data, then I did go into working for the bank side of life. And one of the first banks I worked for was Credit Suisse First Boston, a really quite challenging organisation, because I think I was the third market data head in about 18 months. But there we go. I like a challenge. But I looked after both market data and communications, because this was the time when actually there were what were called dealer boards that the dealers used to speak about market data, and then they were voice recorded. And me and my team, there was about 20 of us, we actually were in the room with no windows where all the dealer voice tapes were stored. So that was quite interesting. Another interesting thing while I was at CSFB was I actually founded IPUG, the Information Providers User Group, which people may not know. But that was me together with a lady called Amanda Rogers from Morgan Stanley.
I remember Amanda,
and Tony Melange from Smith Newcourt. It's fun. And we were kind of known for two things really at IPUG. One, that we got Mike Bloomberg to come and visit us and present to IPUG, which was quite something. And I was quite thrilled because he's not much taller than me. So that was quite nice to know.
There's hope for you yet.
Exactly.
You too can become a billionaire.
Yeah. Well, doesn't seem to have happened yet, but there's still life in the old dog yet. Yeah. And the other thing, of course, that IPUG was famous for was the Christmas parties. But again, we won't go there. So.
I could tell stories about, another podcast. We need to have a podcast all about the trivia of the industry.
Absolutely. But after my 4 and a bit years at Credit Suisse First Boston, I left because they were moving to the wharf, and I actually did a lot of the negotiation for kit to go to the wharf, but I myself couldn't go there because back in the day, transport to the wharf was incredibly difficult, particularly
DLR,
from where I lived. Yeah. So I was asked to go and join Reuters, and I ran what was called the Open Systems Program. So this was for the first time when people moved away from the dumb terminals, and there were what were called open terminals and networked only RT. And that was quite a new world. I had to spend a lot of time talking to the, recruiting even engineers so they could install this stuff with the clients, and talking to the salespeople because it was quite a different world. So that was very exciting. I did that for about 2 years. But then
I think we crossed over there as well, didn't we? I think I was selling Triarch and RMD.
Yeah, absolutely. It was all early days for systems then, wasn't it? Very early days. And there weren't many vendors around. Then I was approached to go to UBS. They've been trying to get me to go and work there for many years. So I went to work for UBS again as head of market data and comms, because in the day that was quite linked. We were based in Broadgate, so I was there about 2.5 years. Then Reuters came back and knocked on my door and invited me to go back to them, and I went back as international news marketing manager, which I'm very passionate about the news, so that was a great job for me. But in my 6 years there, I did many things, including moving to America. So I spent a year running their technology partner program in Palo Alto, where I did all the work with Reuters together with new companies, and we did lots of very innovative things. And then in my last year, I moved to New York and I launched the instant messaging platform, that well-known Bloomberg killer, which was
that killed Bloomberg dead. It was so
so marvelous. But anyway, I mean, it reinforced the fact that messaging and collaboration and network is so important, and so important even now, right? We're years later. As they say, plus ça change, eh? Anyway.
I'm impressed with your French.
Indeed. So then I came back to the UK, and I was in consulting for a couple of years. Then I was headhunted to go to HSBC and be their global head of market data IT. So I went there, and there was actually the 4 centres, so New York, London, Paris, Hong Kong. So I pulled all that together. I actually, while I was running all of that, I negotiated the Reuters Enterprise License Agreement. And for the first time, I added FX transactions into the deal, which was great for HSBC. And then when Thomson acquired or merged, whatever the hell, with Reuters, I negotiated that too. But then, so that was about year 2 into my HSBC stint. But then the front office came to me, and they said, look, you seem to have got that market data rubbish under control. Would you now please sort out ref data, because we've got a real problem here? So I, said, sure, but I think I'll still keep market data if that's okay. And they said, yeah, keep that too.
Shall we use that as a segue? I mean, there's more, but people can look it up on your LinkedIn. Yeah. There's more. Yeah. That was a good segue into one of the key things we were planning to talk about, because you're still doing a lot of work on a consultancy basis with user firms, customer firms, consumer firms, whatever. Yeah, the banks, the people that buy stuff as opposed to the people that sell stuff. And again, something you and I have talked about, and I want us to talk about it on this podcast, is how market data teams are organized and structured. And I think you've just touched on a point. And it's a conversation I often had. What is market data? David Anderson, I don't profess to be right. It's just the way I look at it. I think any data that the markets use is market data. That's how I see it. So I would include reference data and alternative and all these other things, and FX. But other people often, when they use the phrase market data, they mean the pricing data that comes from the markets, like exchanges or whatever. That's what they mean. And I'm not right, and they're not right. But it's confusing because people say different things. And that plays into your thought process, your quandaries or whatever is, well, what is, a market data team? Because if it's my definition, then it's a much bigger thing. But if it's the other definition, it's smaller, and then there are other team. I mean, talk us through, the structures and organizations and the pros and cons of all the, just talk.
Sure. No, absolutely. I will just say that before we start that when they asked me to take over Ref Data, what I actually took over for them was all the data management operations side of life.
Yeah.
So I actually offshored all the folk doing the keying in of, securities and whatever into the systems, offshored all that to Bangalore and did all that gubbins. But anyway, back to the question, which is, what is market data these days? I mean, I would say then it really was very front office focused. Right. And typically away from the front office, so middle and back, risk and all those other areas. It wasn't quite so prevalent then, and B, it was very much more spreadsheet and manually driven in those other areas. So I would say that if you look at how things have morphed, it's very much now that it's front to back. That's what's gone on. So people in the market data teams now are called upon, mostly, I will hesitate and say not everyone, right? But in the main, folk are very concentrated on the front, which is, again, as always, news, prices, historical info, ratings, whatever the heck. In the middle office, it's the ratings, the credit info, all of those sort of things, and obviously different systems. And then in the back office, it's very much, all the reg stuff and compliance and all those sort of things. So a modern market data team these days typically manages all of that complexity. And as you rightly say, there's been additional things. Client data is another area that, again, didn't used to be managed by the market data team, but very much is now. And that's really from the days when, firms like Avox came to be. So, Ken Price and Avox, it started to be that there was data available about your clients, which you could buy.
Was this linked to KYC? Was this?
So know your client, absolutely. So very much you needed to have, you needed to do regulatory checks for a start. Those clients needed to provide information to you. You needed to be able to verify that. You needed to be able to store that. You needed to be able to keep that updated. One of the biggest tricky things in life, and this again is a difference between market and reference data, is the whole thing about identifiers.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, when you're trading or when you're doing anything, trading, settling, whatever the hell, it's really important you're doing it with, guess what, the person you think you are. So in other words, a unique identifier and you having the ability to know that the trade you're doing is with the counterparty you think you're doing it with is absolutely crucial. So that whole area of identifiers is massively important.
I mean, I always used to, when I came more from a real-time pricing data background and reference data, I understand, but not as well.
Yeah.
And a simplistic way I used to say is reference data is data about data. It's data you refer to. So you're talking about identifiers, symbol, you need to refer to that to understand what you're trading and what the pricing data is to make sure the price of the thing that you're looking at, what that thing is.
Exactly.
I mean, what is reference data the same as metadata? I don't know. I get muddled up. What?
No, I mean, excuse me, frog in my throat, little French frog in my throat. No, I mean, metadata is effectively all the data. It's data about data. That's what metadata is. But reference data is typically the static data. Yeah. So if you think about market data, it's really much more about things that change. I mean, within a day, many things can change. Yeah. Prices, news, for example. News is a really interesting one. I said before that I was, international news marketing manager at Reuters. I mean, one of the things about news is that Reuters actually, I suppose it still does, it certainly used to, it never used to actually publish until something had been verified.
Yeah.
So there was the news, you'd get the news flash very quickly, but then you probably wouldn't necessarily trade on that from Reuters' perspective until you had the verified, proper indicator. Now, and that was a differentiator with Bloomberg, because Bloomberg used to just put the news out. They didn't double verify,
Yeah.
but anyway, so that's an important difference. But the world of identifiers and static data is all about things like country codes, currency codes, all those things which you don't expect to change. And an amusing story I'll tell you, when I was first asked to take on reference data at HSBC, they asked me to, and that was for the investment bank, by the way, while I still did the commercial for the whole bank, but they asked me if I'd talk to the kind of group folk who were doing reference data. I'm like, sure. So I went to speak to them, and they had a database, but I kid you not, they've been 5 years trying to get this database, which is just currency codes and country codes.
Would that database, and tell me if I'm muddling concept, is that where you get this concept of a securities master file or the golden copy? These are phrases that get banned.
So a security master is actually the identifiers themselves of the stocks, as well as the prices. So that's your security master. And what your goal is it's all about uniqueness. So you need to know in your security master that you have unique information, and that when a price comes in for that particular stock traded on that particular exchange, that it's accurately recorded, and so that your traders, when they're looking at the screens, maybe they've got the data coming through Reuters or Bloomberg or whatever, that they know that is accurate and valid,
and that unique, accurate and valid securities master file, the accurate and valid bit makes it golden.
Correct.
So golden's it's not a literal thing. It's a descriptor of a thing to say that it's accurate and true. Because wasn't the problem, I remember this years ago, that firms would have multiple databases of supposedly the same things, but with different data in them.
Absolutely. So while being at DMCS, for example, I actually did a project with a very large firm, which I won't tell you it is, but a tier 1 bank. And they had actually bought a new data management solution which would manage their golden copy security master.
Is it sometimes an EDM, an enterprise data? Phrase EDM. Yeah, okay.
Exactly. Now they had 17, that's 17 systems that all had to go onto that one platform. So along the way, you had to have rules. So what are the rules that we use to ensure that we've got quality? What will we do? What are we discarding versus what are we promoting, as it were? Because you quite often have a hierarchy of, you look at the price, but if it looks different, spikes to last price, you go, well, that's a bit odd. Let me check. I'll look at my maybe other source. I look at my second source so I can verify whether that spike is valid and accurate or not. So whole world
has that all been solved? Because that's a long time ago. Has it all?
Well, okay. So I'll say yes and no as ever, right? Because I'm astounded. I still go and meet firms all the time, and they still haven't even got a system. And I'm like, surely you must have a system. No, we just do it all on spreadsheets. I'm like, really? Anyway, they do. But secondly, the firms themselves, so Reuters, Bloomberg, SIX, ICE, whoever they may be, who are feeding those systems, pretty much do have excellent quality checking themselves. So you might think, why do you need the quality checking in your downstream system when your aggregator has allegedly checked it and sent it to you? Well, I will tell you why, because 95% of the time it is absolutely correct, but maybe 5% of the time, depending, it's not correct. And then you have these spikes, and you need to be able to check and verify very quickly what the real numbers are, because your trader can't really be waiting while this kind of, disputes or whatever are going on, and they need to know that everything is accurate. And other things they need to be able to do, for example, another thing that these security mastering firms give to them is that, say there's a new stock that's come and it takes a little while for it to get its identifier, like it's ISIN or QSIP or whatever it may be. So what we need to do is we need to create what we call a dummy stock first, so that the traders are ready to trade the minute the proper identifiers are available. So all of that also has to be fed into those systems.
Do we dare go down the rabbit hole? You've just mentioned ISIN and QSIP, and there's a lot of controversy about QSIP. And I'm trying not to take sides. I'm trying to be a sort of imperious, watching it all from above. But what's your take on that controversy?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if I'm not mistaken, QSIP is now owned by FactSet.
It is, yeah.
Which is an interesting thing. In fact, I will share with you all that the last project I did, I was looking at various things, and the FactSet number seemed terribly big when I knew they kind of didn't have FactSet terminals. And so I said, well, so what's this then? And they said, oh, it's QSIP. So I'm like, okay, well, a little clue. Let me just call it that then. I don't know. Then, like, for idiots like me, oh no, that's what it is. But anyway, but yeah, I think that what's really interesting is those identifiers, so ISINs, QSIPs, whatever they may be. And don't forget, the theory from Bloomberg is that you could maybe use Figgy, their identifier.
Yeah.
And
although that's not theirs anymore. They've sort of made it open source and all wrapped up in a bow separately.
Absolutely. But so there's that as well. And then another one, and sorry, I'm slightly going off into a tangent.
I knew we would.
But it's sort of easier in the world of securities, because if you think about it, IBM, it trades on say the New York Stock Exchange, and this is its identifier, right? That's kind of well known. But in the world of client data, it's much harder, because one of the reasons the 2007-8 crash was so appalling was that lots of firms realized for the first time that they had thousands of entity names for their clients, where, what the client's name would be limited with a dot, limited LIMITED.
Yeah.
They'd have different addresses, but it was the same people, blah, 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 blah. So in the world of client data, they tried to do this thing called LEI.
Yeah. Legal entity identifier. Yeah.
Now, remember how long this has all been taking.
I know.
And just going on to a more modern phenomenon, ESG, wouldn't you have thought people would think to themselves, oh, blimey, back in the hideous old days, it was all so difficult. We didn't have consistency, whatever. So you'd have thought they might have thought, for ESG, a new thing, let's start with consistency. Did they? Did they buggery? No, of course they didn't do that.
Good technical phrase there, Sally. Look, crikey. Each of these topics, identifiers, ESG, reference data, it's a massive topic in its own right. But bringing it back to the organizational structure, we could have a whole podcast just about discussing each of those, and maybe we should. But the focus of today, we're trying to focus in, is the organizational structure that looks after that diverse set of different data types. And actually, let me throw something else into the mix, which is something I notice as well. Yeah. Another dimension is almost like a matrix of this. Another dimension is the commercial and data perspective.
Yeah.
Contrasted against the technology and systems perspective, because you've got different types of data which you've got to understand and everything, and then you've got all these weird and wacky commercial terms and conditions that are relating to that. But then you've got a whole genre, topic, whatever you want to call it, of like the systems and technology to take this on board, ingest it, distribute it, track it, whatever. And again, organizationally, those can be separate or together, or again, let's go back to the perfect organization, or the typical organization, or typical organizations.
Yeah. So I will tell you that I've worked in every connotation, you'll be surprised to hear, of this conundrum. So I've run market data teams, and indeed enterprise data management teams. in IT. In fact, I started Global Head of Market Data IT, and I had the ITT, and that was my responsibility as well as the commercial piece. I've worked in ops because, sometimes people think, well, market data and enterprise data is kind of that's just
what is ops? I mean, it's operations, but what is it?
Yeah.
What does it mean?
Well, so basically, that's where all the the kind of the settling, the managing, the operational underpinning of the company happens. I mean, that's what that's all about. Settlements and all those side of things. So, there are times I've worked in ops, and in fact, the last project I just did for a buy side firm, their market data team was indeed in ops, as it happens.
So there's ops.
I'm not a fan of that.
There's IT.
Yep.
Procurement.
Yeah.
The business. What are the other permutations that you've seen?
Yeah. Now, I do not advocate that market data should be in procurement, because the trouble I find with procurement folk, I mean, I apologise to any procurement
They're
folk.
A wonderful bunch of people. We love them.
Lovely folk, right? And I definitely encourage close alignment. But what I find is that in procurement, and this is a bit of a generalisation, but so again, forgive me, procurement folk, but I find that they think that data is like buying a pencil.
Yeah.
And when I was at HSBC, I remember once that, the head of procurement person came to me and they said, well, we've got this consultancy firm. They want to come in and they've got this plan about, strategic sourcing. And they tell us they can save us 40% on, the market data. I'm like, yeah, heard it before. Let them come in. So they came in, God bless them. And the guy says to me, he says, well, so my view is that we will tell the front office that they can't have Bloomberg anymore. And that's the end of it.
Yeah.
That's the end of it. Oh, look at all this video stuff. I'm like, whatever the hell his name was, I immediately expunged it, obviously. I said, whatever your hell his name, you go out and talk to them. I'll be behind you all the way, like 2 miles behind you, but absolutely. I
mean, I've heard that story a million times.
It's ridiculous. Sorry, but I should say, on the other hand, that we market data / enterprise data folk do sometimes try and make market data and its procurement seem more complex than it is, because at the end of the day, right, it's a contract, it's terms and conditions, it's the pricing structure, it's usage, right? It's those normal things that, the procurement folk are perfectly possible, for them to do stuff with it. So we equally are at fault sometimes of making it seem like a dark art where it isn't.
There are dark elements to it, complicated elements, but not everything.
Great.
And
right.
I mean, so there's, where does these data teams report into? And my experience from having dealt with lots of friends who work on the customer side is, one day they're working for IT, and then somebody way up in the organization says, let's switch it over to ops or procurement or something. And then some big chief, some really senior person changes everything, because that's what people do when they get given a new division.
Yeah. And so when I was at HSBC, I started in IT, reporting to IT, as I mentioned. Then I moved to the front office, because the front office were really keen that I actually they wanted me in the front office because they knew I could make the best change from the front office. If I was sitting in the back office with IT, say, that this was their view, which I sadly endorsed, was that, IT gets very, they're not good at explaining things to people, particularly users. So things sometimes take a lot longer than you'd wish them to do. So they said to me, come and work in the front office, because, you can really, implement change from the front office, which I duly did. But then, towards the end of my 5-year stint there, guess what? I ended up in ops. So, I mean, I went everywhere.
And it's all about, a lot about personalities. Who's the head of that,
Absolutely.
and they often bring all their mates in. If they were
Yeah,
the
yeah,
former head in Goldman Sachs and they moved to, they bring in all their mates that they used to
yeah.
work with, and all the
Exactly.
consult. Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, that is life. That is,
But the thing I will say is the most success I ever had was being in the business. And when I
AKA
go,
the front office. Is when you say the business and
absolutely,
front office, that's the same thing, isn't it? Yeah.
exactly. And while I was there, and I've done many projects since where they asked me to recommend an operating model, and I always say, be as close to the business as you can possibly be. And from a structural sense, even if you are part of the business, I mean, I always have kind of team structures, right? And I have business alignment, I have vendor alignment, and then I have administration, and then if I'm lucky, IT or whatever. And I do it like that because each of those functions
Yeah.
have requirements and have their things they have to do and keep running on a regular basis. But if you have it that way, then it means you're quite aligned, you know more what's going on. Because one of the key things that makes a data team's job so hard is that you really need to see everything that's going on in a firm. You need to see IT changes. You need to understand business changes. You need to understand operations changes because, trust me, every one of those changes has a data
And they're all
impact. Everything.
interlinked. Actually, I
Yeah.
mean, this goes back to something I was asking you about yesterday, because again, within the market data team, we're not talking about where it fits in organizationally, but
Mm.
the structure and makeup of a team. That
Yeah.
that connectivity with the business, I'm presuming that it's typically referred to as business analysts or analysts,
Yeah.
the
That's
people
right.
whose job is to really work closely with the front office and understand their needs and
Exactly.
requirements and problems and whatever, and report back into the middle. And then
Yeah.
your vendor alignment would be vendor managers. There's a new genre. This in the old
Exactly.
days, this was all one person, but it's now
I
been
know.
broken into subgroups. You've got vendor
Yeah.
managers who have to really know, how Bloomberg works or how
Yeah.
S&P works, and
Exactly.
they get
Yeah.
into, and then administrators are doing, as the name suggests, all the admin, all the
All the
billing,
stuff.
the contracts, or
Yeah.
administrating the contracts, not
Yeah.
negotiating them, administrating, and then IT.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, that's are there any other? I mean, you've got analysts,
Yeah.
vendor managers, administrators,
Yeah.
and IT. I mean, who
So
else? What?
the other, and I sadly don't see it often, but I think it's a mistake, really good practice to have a project management team, even if it's only a project manager, because I see time and time again that firms can't do change
Yeah.
because it's a skill to do change, right? And you really have to be able to concentrate on it and understand the true impact of change, because most people just think about the upside of change. They don't kind of think about how you're going to undo the things that you're changing and how you're going to make sure it all works properly, and that you if you've got to purge data, you do it, and so on and so on. And I find that most organizations these days don't think you need a project manager in market data, yet they expect them to do incredibly complex change projects. Actually, they just don't call them that. Like, so we've got, so for example, again, in one that I recently worked with, they got them to work on, in fact, the negotiation with a post trade platform. Now, you've got to know and understand a lot to be able to do that, and you need time to do it. And if you don't give them the time, well, it's not going to be the most effective and optimal
Well,
solution, is it?
I mean, going back to our days in Reuters, and I think you might have
Mm,
worked when I was in Reuters. I was on the sales side, so I was out there
yeah.
selling. We had a lot of engineers and admin, but we had a whole department that was called project management
And I
because,
started there.
because a lot of the things we were selling were so complicated and what
Hmm.
have you. You know, good old salesmen like me would
Absolutely.
go in, yes, crack the champagne open, job done. Well, no,
Yeah.
that was the job started. Once you'd
Yeah.
sold it, there was a massive job of implementing. So I hear that. Let me throw a couple of
Absolutely.
other things I've heard. I've in user firms, in consumer customer firms,
Mm.
product managers, and
Yes.
I've
Oh,
never
yeah.
quite. Well, product managers is one phrase. Another one is category managers or category.
Yep.
Yeah. What
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
those? I mean, what does that mean?
So, okay, so let's start with product managers. Now, again, I'll give you an example. This is an HSBC example, but it's an HSBC example from my DMCS hat on.
Right.
Because a couple of years ago, they invited me to go back and run all the data management projects in the IB, in the investment bank. And I was working with one of the teams that was trying to provide, I beg your pardon, the data management operations to the business.
Right.
But what struck me, and bearing in mind, I've been both on the vendor side and on the user side, and I said to these guys, look, the problem is you don't consider that this platform you're looking after and this data products you're giving are products, and you need a product manager to look after them properly, because you need to be marketing that, because, I'm sorry, you think you just say to the business, you've got to have your data from me, and they'll go, yeah, fair enough. Because you know what business people are like, they probably will try and get around it. But anyway, you've got to kind of sell it a bit. And then also, if you're running a platform, you need to change things, because things are changing all the time. I mean, I don't know if you know, but I mean, market data change notifications come up, say, at Bloomberg, like bloody bucket loads every day. So you've got to be able to manage these things as a product. So, I mean, I said that to those guys. I said, and because they were trying to get the risk team to come onto their product, and they had a different product. And I said, so let's approach it in a completely different way. We're like an internal vendor, right? You're trying to get this team of folk, users, to take this product. So let's pretend we're a business, selling it and do it that way.
The product in that context could be made up of multiple elements bought from different vendors and pulled together. So a product manager is different from a vendor manager. The product manager would be liaising with multiple vendor managers, taking on board all the different elements that have been bought externally.
Yep.
Having some internal development people sort of package it all up and implement it, then probably dealing with the business analysts who are trying to understand so it's another, again, category management. What's that?
So category management is a different thing, and it's more about, so say LSEG, as they now are, so London Stock Exchange Group, which now owns Reuters and all the many, many things it does. I mean, quite frankly, if you look at the picture, which I have, of all the stuff they now provide, I mean, it's phenomenal. So if you're a user organization, it's quite complex for your teams. If there's loads of stuff that you're looking after, it's quite complex for them to know and understand everything from a particular vendor. So another kind of slice, but you've got to be quite big to be able to do this, I would say. You won't have enough people in your team otherwise. But so index data and ratings data and all these things are incredibly complex. Their license terms change on a pin.
Yeah.
And they constantly keep changing their policies so they get more money. In fact, I think the index business recently rose 12% in their profits this year, crazy, bonkers. But anyway, so all these things are quite different. So having people who understand the category of, say, index and ratings or real-time data is really important if you spend a lot of money in that category. And you need to really understand what the different components of adding that up are, so that you can recommend the best value to your business and you make sure your business is using that category correctly.
So you could have in an organization, the analysts, the vendor managers, the administrators, and product managers and category managers, and then somebody sitting on top trying to make sure it all... I mean, the coordination of all that can, and I presume does, get a bit complicated.
Extremely so. But I always think that so the two things, though, that I always try and stress to people is business alignment, vendor management. Issue 3, admin. I mean, you've got to have those three things all working properly, because otherwise those kind of they're not lower, but the kind of the more detailed things below, you can't get anywhere near them unless you have those structures correct.
Let me ask you, based on everything we've just been talking about, I want you to sort of guide us on two things. The first thing is, based on what we all just talked about, what would your advice be to a user organization? I mean, we've sort of done it, but I mean, wrap it all up in a bow, and then the other part is all of those vendors out, and probably not the big sophisticated ones who probably understand this, but all, remember that long tail we've talked about, all these medium and smaller vendors who are trying to engage and frankly sell to these with probably really good products, really how should they do that? So the first, start with perfect advice to a user firm, and then talk about vendors.
So best practice, you would have your senior manager at the top, you have your business team closely aligned to the business,
business
and
analysts,
probably segmented, business analysts, demand management, whatever you want to call them, and they'll probably be focused on the different business lines. So, someone for fixed income, private markets, for example. Private markets, huge area, quite different, etc., etc. Then vendor management, very important, because again, these vendors now, Bloomberg, LSEG, Standard & Poor's, they're multi-billion-dollar firms, right? And you're trying to deal with them, very complex. So I'd have that. But and the admin side and the project management and the IT, but overarching all over this is proper governance. So really be clear about what your team is delivering to the business. You've got proper reporting so that everybody knows what they're getting, why they're getting what they're getting and how they could change what they're getting. And on at least on a quarterly basis, if not monthly basis, meet with the senior managers in the business and actually go through all of this, make it very transparent to them, and explain to them, actually, this is something we haven't talked about, but this is so important, explain to them what is addressable, as in you can make a cost saving out of this bit of the budget that you spend versus this bit over here. Let's not even waste our time looking at that nonsense, because I best of all in the world, I can't make any difference there.
Picking up on that, because I've heard so often from friends of mine sitting in the customer firm saying, in order to make big changes and to enact some of these big cuts, you've got to get senior manager buy-in. I mean, we don't want to have a go at Bloomberg. Bloomberg is a brilliant company with a brilliant product, but because of its brilliance, people have put bucket loads of money into it and spend a lot on it, and therefore it's a victim of its own successes. But you can't, to your story earlier on, if you go to mid-level, the business, heads of desk or something, they're going to say, over my dead body, and do you know who I am? I'm really important. You minor market data person, run away and don't trouble me. So you need to go even higher, I presume, to get those.
So let me tell you something I did when this, again, data management consulting hat on. I was involved in a cost optimization project at a tier one organization. And they spent billions and squillions, right? And so I looked at what they were doing and I thought to myself, I'm going to do two, what might be considered quite unusual things. But anyway, you know me, I've always wanted to do different things. So one thing was, I said, number one, see all that spend on Bloomberg terminals, you've got to stop that, because you have Reuters coming in on the desktop. So you've got all your traders and other folk looking at their Bloomberg terminal. Well, actually, they've got their trading infrastructure is got Reuters on it. That makes no sense. So really, let's try and get rid of that of Bloomberg where we can. And hey, you COOs of the business, I recommend you walk the talk. You guys give up your Bloomberg, show that you can make this difference. And because I've checked your stats and you're only looking at chat and booking lunch and whatever the crap. So give up your Bloombergs. That will be a good thing to do. But I said, but conversely, what I will recommend that you do, and I'm happy to run it for you, I recommend that you have a strategic partnership with Bloomberg. Now, I know that might sound counterintuitive because, the word partnership and Bloomberg, bit of an oxymoron, but hey, keep with me. If we do that, they, I think, will work with us because God knows we're a big firm and we certainly spend loads of money. And they're trying to get into the real-time world and they're really struggling.
Yeah.
So if we can help them with some of these things they want to do and you want to do, happy days. Well, I say that. I got the 8 COOs together and the Bloomberg head, it was the guy with the initial headers, anyway, him, to come and present to us. Yeah. And I'll tell you, it was the first time those 8 COOs had been in the room together. First time. So we had the meeting, and I have to tell you that the Bloomberg guy, the COO said to me afterwards, it was the worst meeting they'd ever attended. He was arrogant. He was just truly awful and really not remotely helpful. So I thought, oh dear, this isn't a good start. But me, again, I'm like, not allowing that to put me off. So I continued on the real-time side and we started to make really good progress. So in the end, and I said to the Bloomberg guys, we really need to think about this. And I went through the account manager, who was a really good person. And I said, I think we need to kind of change. It didn't go down well, but I think we can really change this. So we did this strategic partnership, and it took us 9 months. And what we did is we unraveled a lot of that Reuters enterprise. They had a global data license, and hilariously, it was coming up to be negotiated, so it was perfect timing. So I said to the procurement guy, I want Reuters to tell us how this part of the global data license, how have they worked it out? It's like 8 million a year. What's behind that? What's the business model behind it? So they went to Reuters and Reuters came back and said, it's a black box and we can't tell you. I'm like, I think you'll find we'll be able to work it out, and if you can't work it out, then I'll have a damn good go myself.
I'm looking at the time, and time has raced away with us. I think we're on a good roll here, and I think what you were just saying is a segue into the other thing that I asked about how should vendors interact, and I think we need to split that into two. If you're a Bloomberg or an LSEG or an S&P or even a FactSet, the bigger players, then if I'm hearing you right, serious strategic. Because to be blunt, and we haven't got time to talk about this, but one of the issues I'm wrestling with, which I can't square in my own mind, is I constantly hear from customer firms, cut 5%, cut 10%, cut, And that's what they want, and I presume that's what they sort of achieve. But then when you look at all the vendors, they're all announcing growth.
Yeah,
How does that somebody must be spending them, somebody must be not cutting.
Right. So vendors. So my recommendation is, and I always stress this to firms, get yourself a strategic vendor partnership. Work with, your top vendors and actually get them to show you which of their products can displace these tail vendors. Because, for example, last project I did, 50 tail vendors, but the spend was only 12% of the total spend of the firm, because the top 10 vendors was all the rest. Well, if actually the top 3 was
is that healthy? Concentrating so much in these big vendors. I mean, are the tail vendors then, in inverted commas, bad? Not bad personally, but bad for the company. I mean, what?
Well, so I would say this: what you need to do if you're a tail vendor, and by the way, I should say one of the things I do a lot with my DMCS hat on is I work a lot with startup companies, because I do find actually a lot of the startup companies are truly awful at selling what they have. They really can't explain it properly. Anyway, so I genuinely think that there are niche products, but what you have to be able to do is, if you've got a product, you have to be very clear. What are its use cases? Why would a firm buy it? What's it for? Does it improve operational efficiency? Does it save costs? does it increase revenue? I mean,
It's
different things,
benefits,
right?
not features, because they all want to say all the things it does.
Yeah,
And I
who
would
gives a
say
shit
you should
about that?
say, so what? Which means
Yeah,
that, it's sales 101.
100% is, but I can't tell you how much time I spend with people. I mean, sometimes they show me their slide deck and we'll be at slide 9 before they even are remotely near addressing what the customer
Because
needs.
they're so
So
excited
truly,
about what their product is. They're
I know,
so excited by it. So look,
bless
Sally, we are creeping
them.
to the end. And look, we
Mm.
could have talked for hours. We do when we talk. We do talk for hours, which is great. But I'm so look, as we sort of slide into this last 5-10 minutes or
Yeah.
whatever. I said I was going to do this. I mean, hit me with 2 or 3 big points, either repeating what we've already said, but even
Mm.
amplifying it,
Yeah.
or have we missed anything that is really critical?
Well, so I would say a couple of things. On the cost saving thing, I would say be bold and controversial. So, several cost saving things I've done. I don't just look at the data costs. I actually look at operational and business processes. Now, they haven't asked me to do that, but that doesn't stop me, right? But so I look and I go, that's funny. You're doing this, like you've got 50 fixed income analysts, but you also are buying all this fixed income research over here, both from the vendors and you've got these fixed income research brokers. Why is all that? And truly, are you getting value? And I listened to your Kevin Morgan podcast the other day, and I know you talked about ROI, and that's what I challenge people to say. So what's the ROI there? What are your 50 analysts, internal analysts doing? Because maybe you don't need them. And then try and encourage peer talking to peers, actually not just peer benchmarking, but talking to peers about what they're doing, particularly if you're on the same platform. So the folk that are on Aladdin, the folk that are on Charles River on the buy side, talk to other users and see what they're
And
doing.
that's not collusion, is it? Is it collusion? Or
No,
where does
not at
collusion?
all.
Yeah.
Not at all. You're just literally a bunch of folk trying to help your users, right?
And understand best practices. What's the best
Yeah,
way of, yeah.
exactly. The other thing I would say, and we haven't talked about it yet, but again, and it's back to a kind of organizationally structural thing, I find that because the kind of currency of the market data team is lower now, and particularly lower than chief data office
Yeah,
teams, which
yeah.
are kind of up there, try and make sure you're involved in product decisions that the business make. So, for example, when they're looking to go into a new market, when they're looking to launch a new benchmark or whatever it may be, inject yourself into those conversations. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to start with, but just persevere and maybe make it part of the governance, because it's important that they understand the true cost of that thing they think they're going to do, because often they forget about data. And I remember for years, they'd go off and they do all these decisions. They'd come back and they'd say to me, so Sally, we're now, we've launched this thing, we need you to do that data over there. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? It gives me like 2 days to do that. And you've been working on this for
I mean,
6
this is a
months.
whole podcast in its own. The currency of the market data teams. I mean, we did
Yeah,
talk, and we haven't talked indeed about CDOs, chief data
yeah,
officers, which was, I don't know
yeah.
when they first came up, probably 10 years ago or something. But there's,
15. So like Peter Serenita and John Bottega back in the. I mean, I
I know,
almost was a chief data
I
officer.
know,
I
and even
unbelievably
that
turned
was,
down studio role.
there were a lot of questions about whether they were taken seriously or not or whatever. But I mean, a classic. Have you ever heard of a chief market data officer?
No.
I mean, the top rungs is like MD. You
Yeah.
get executive director, you get some MDs and whatever.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
to your point about currency, it's like they don't have a seat at the top table.
They don't. And I think, and my observation is, and I've been there a long time, right? There was a time when we were at the top table. I can tell you that, and I
Yeah.
know that. And I observe now when I go, even the big firms, they aren't anymore.
And whose fault is that? Is that the people who should have fought to be on the top table, or is that the fault of the ultimate senior management for not recognizing the true value of market data that they should?
I think that the thing I find with most firms is that they have too many revolving doors, right? So most organizations, they blow with the wind. So there's time when CDOs were really important and they weren't, and blah, 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 blah. And also, the other thing I will tell you is that people think to themselves, when I did the ref data thing for HSBC, they're like, that's done then. We could all, move on now. And I'm like, no, actually. This is an ongoing thing. It's like having a baby. The baby grows up. You've got to keep managing it.
But also, I mean, an observation I'd make, because I remember from our days the roaring 80s, Big Bang, and it was just going crazy. And even there were some dips in the 90s, but then there was some, but in the last, definitely since the financial crisis, and maybe even before that, the big players, the big investment banks, and maybe the buy side have not been doing that well. I mean, they're not exactly hard. They're not poor. No, but they're not doing as well as they did in their heyday.
No.
And therefore this constant striving for cost reduction.
Absolutely.
It's a sort of negative frame of mind. I don't know. I mean, it's very easy for me to say this, but.
Well, I think the big change, in my opinion, is regulatory stuff. So, it really came from the crash, fair enough. But what I would say now is we have excessive regulation, and I'm not sure who it benefits, to be frank. And I do know there was a long time, possibly even still now, where the best way to get a project to be approved was for it to have the reg hat on it. If it had the reg hat,
I know that.
Otherwise, forget about it.
I know that stamp. It was cost containment and regulatory compliance were the two things that would get budget. And I think on your the phrase that springs to mind about was it the road to hell is paved with good intentions. They're all the ideas, the concepts were good, but then it just gets bogged down.
Too bureaucratic, massively too bureaucratic.
I know. Sally, we've got to stop. We've got to stop. This has been brilliant. Look, I've really enjoyed this.
Me
talking
too.
to a fellow from the 40, you probably have 42, 43 years in market data, or it is. I've only got 41. So I hope the audience I've found this interesting. I think the audience will find this interesting. I love comments from people, and I am trying to get some heads of market data to speak, but they talk about bureaucracy. Trying to be allowed to speak on a public domain is a nightmare. So Sally, massive thank, and I just hope the technology is going to work. I'm going to press the stop button and keep my fingers crossed. Otherwise, we'll have to do it all again. I must get my glasses straightened as well. Anyway,
I just hope it edits out my swearing, but never mind.
Well, you never know. It adds a bit of colour.
Exactly.
Anyway, bye. I'm just pressing the stop button.
Yeah, thanks, David.